I had seen the rise of terrorism. I had seen the increase in terrorism intelligence and cases and investigations coming through. So on September 11th, I'm home on maternity leave. I'm nursing my newborn son, and I have the news on in the morning. And I saw the first plane hit. And I have to say, while I think most Americans were frightened and confused, my immediate reaction was no trained commercial pilot would have flown a plane directly into that building. And so my first thought was that there was something terribly wrong and that it was likely an intentional act. When I saw the second one, I immediately thought of al-Qaeda.
The podcast of CBS This Morning will begin after this short break.
Today's CBS This Morning podcast is sponsored by Land O'Frost Premium Deli Meats.
I'm Gayle King.
I'm Anthony Mason.
And I'm Tony DeCopel.
And this is a CBS This Morning podcast.
I'm Adriana Diaz, a CBS News correspondent. As we take time today to remember the nearly 3,000 lives lost on September 11th, 2001, we're also taking a look at how far America has come regarding Homeland Security and the war on terror. I'm joined in New York by Fran Townsend, CBS News senior national security analyst and the former assistant to President George W. Bush for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. Fran, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's hard to believe that it's been 18 years.
It's amazing to me because I had one of my sons was born just under 2 weeks before 9/11 happened. And so I remember it sort of around his birthday. Mm-hmm. And he just turned 18.
He just turned 18.
Yeah, and he's literally tomorrow starting as a freshman at Princeton.
Wow. So back on that morning, I'm sure like so many Americans remember where you were, what your first thoughts were?
So let me back up for a second, because before I gave birth on August 29th, I had been at the Justice Department and I had been running what is now known as the National Security Division, but it was the place where you generated the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the secret wiretaps that are now famous. And so I had seen the rise of terrorism. I had seen the increase in terrorism intelligence and cases and investigations coming through. So on September 11th, I'm home on maternity leave. I'm nursing my newborn son, and I have the news on in the morning. And I saw the first plane hit. And I have to say, while I think most Americans were frightened and confused, my immediate reaction was no trained commercial pilot would have flown a plane directly into that building. They would have done what years later Sully Sullenberger did, mm-hmm. which was land it in the Hudson. But you wouldn't have deliberately flown it into a building. And so my first thought was that there was something terribly wrong and that it was likely an intentional act. When I saw the second one, I immediately thought of al-Qaeda.
That's what it took. It took that second plane to make you make that link to al-Qaeda. Why was it that you didn't think of al-Qaeda after the first plane?
Well, I did, right? Because I was suspicious that it was a deliberate act. Mm-hmm. Who would have had the incentive? I had lived through the Cole bombing, the East Africa embassy bombings. Multiple simultaneous attacks was al-Qaeda's hallmark. And so I was suspicious when I saw the first one that it was al-Qaeda. I had no doubt when I saw the second.
And in that time, I remember there was a lot of conversation about how the intelligence community didn't connect the dots. Can you explain that a bit to me? Because you seem to know immediately afterward that it was al-Qaeda, but why were those dots not connected beforehand?
Well, again, I think the intelligence community saw this rise in terrorism intelligence and sort of, you often hear the chatter. There's a rise in the collection of intelligence, but they're not always clear pieces. Mm-hmm. Once you look back, when you pick up a piece of intelligence like we did that says a cake and two sticks, meaning the date 9/11, with hindsight, that seems obvious. But you can see how the intelligence community might have collected that and not understood what that meant at the time. And so I think we didn't understand quite as well as we do now how al-Qaeda operated, what their organizational structure was. All of that took time after 9/11 for us to really have a good fidelity into the hierarchy and the inner workings of al-Qaeda.
Afterwards, the Department of Homeland Security was established to try to reduce the possibility to have these blind spots, to connect more of those dots. Do you think that's really been achieved?
So I think we were probably, as a country, overly ambitious. It's often after something happens, right? We have this very strong reaction, and it's not necessarily the most efficient or effective. So what 9/11 should have produced in DHS was a border security agency, an agency that was focused on people and commercial goods, anything crossing your border. Instead, we created this behemoth agency that had many different missions and many different cultures. And I think they suffered from that for a long time. I think it's better now. But I think we built something that was not exactly an answer to what the problem was. Now, I do think that they have been extraordinary in what they've been able to accomplish. But I think building such a big department and expecting it to be easily integrated was probably naive.
How did 9/11 change the way that you did your job?
So at that time, I had just transferred over to the Coast Guard, and I was there as the Assistant Commandant for Intelligence with the idea that I was going to set up an intelligence collection capability. They already had an analysis capability. They had a targeting operation for drug interdictions in the Pacific and the Caribbean. 9/11 happened, and one of the president's first questions was, who's responsible for port security? At the time, as I'm told, the story was the cabinet looked at one another. Norm Mineta, who was the Secretary of Transportation, said, I think that's my responsibility through the Coast Guard, because that's where the Coast Guard resided before the department. He came back. He called over to the Coast Guard. The next thing I knew, as the Assistant Commandant for Intelligence, I was in his office briefing him on how do we collect intelligence? What do we do? What were the resources put against it? And that, frankly, is how I wound up briefing the White House.
I feel like there's so many signs of September 11th all around that we don't really notice. It really changed the psychology of what it means to grow up and live in this country. How has what we consider a terror threat evolved since 9/11?
So I think the threat of international terrorism will never completely subside because it's not a thing, it's an ideology. And it's hard to defeat an ideology. Over time, we've defeated Nazism and fascism. I think the sort of extremist point of view is going to be in pockets. And we see actually now a resurgence of that extremist ideology, even having taken the caliphate away from ISIS. And so I think that's always going to be a threat. The more concerning threat to me at the moment is domestic terrorism. And I think we have to call it and name it what it is, whether it's El Paso or it's Ohio or it's Texas, right? These mass shootings by people who do them in the name of an ideology, whether it's, a racist ideology or it's a xenophobic ideology or it's extremist nationalism. I find that when it's a white person who pulls the trigger at one of these events, our immediate impulse nationally is to say he's crazy. There's a mental illness, and there may be. But we don't seem to hesitate if it's a Muslim who pulls the trigger or a person of color, they're a terrorist. And I think we have to get over that. We have to understand anybody who pulls a trigger or commits a violent act in the name of an ideology for a political purpose against a civilian population is a terrorist, and we have to treat them equally. I am incredibly frustrated if the events that have taken place domestically here in the last several months had been perpetrated by an international terrorist group. We'd have had every member of Congress standing on the steps of the Capitol, lighting candles and holding memorials and passing things like the Patriot Act.
And considering invading another country, perhaps.
And what have we seen? They can't even get together and agree on an enhanced background check bill. I mean, it is so frustrating to me because this is on the rise and more Americans are going to get killed. And we have to be as diligent and as determined against domestic terrorism as we were against international terrorism post 9/11.
And what would change if we did label the domestic attacks as terrorism? What does that then unlock? What resources does that make available? Or is it just a shift in the mentality of the public?
So I think, one, it is a shift in the mentality about our determination, right? I think it taps into a determination that we discovered in ourselves post 9/11. I also think it then unlocks the discussion about what authorities, legal, law enforcement, intelligence, do we need to be able to fight this domestically? It won't be the same. You won't want it to be the same as the tools you've used internationally, but some of them will. Let me give you an example. In the El Paso case, the guy posted his manifesto, if you will, on 8chan. This is a dark web website that's hosted overseas. And so I would think what you want to use is the kind of targeting authorities we used internationally to take down that website. Even though it's not an international terrorism group, the impact is domestically. The government ought to be able to use the authorities that we used internationally to attack that website.
But then isn't the question whether that's an infringement of someone's freedom of speech?
So we wrestled with this in the context of terrorism. The example there is social media sites in the beginning of ISIS, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, were posting the beheading videos. Not all speech is protected speech, and we have to come to grips with that. Beheading videos are not protected speech, and after much debate with the social media companies and dragging them in front of Congress, they finally came around to the fact that they have a responsibility to both take that stuff down and notify law enforcement.
Now, as we grapple with the rise of white supremacy in the U.S., there are still threats overseas. There are still troops overseas. And one of the president's biggest challenges is finding a way out of Afghanistan. What are your thoughts on the fact that he was going to meet with members of the Taliban, members of the Afghan government at Camp David? Do you think that was smart? Do you think clearly the optics of doing it near September 11th wasn't the best decision? But aside from that, what do you make of the talks?
So having the president of Afghanistan to Camp David, having any head of state to Camp David is expected, is acceptable, right? Having the Taliban is different. And here's why. This is the group. You mentioned it was nearly 3,000 people killed on 9/11. And while ultimately bin Laden was killed inside Pakistan, we know he was able to plan, plot, and launch the September 11th attack from Afghanistan because the Taliban gave him safe haven. They have the blood of almost 3,000 Americans on their hands. There is no circumstance under which I would recommend the president have them to Camp David. I wouldn't recommend the president of the United States meet with them. And frankly, I question whether an American ought to be sitting across the table from them. I am sympathetic to the president's concern about removing troops from Afghanistan. But I will tell you, I think that comes with great risk to remove everyone. We know for a fact if there is safe haven and ungoverned space, this is where international terrorist groups thrive, whether that's Yemen or Afghanistan. And so I think you have to make up your mind you're going to leave a residual force, let's call it 5,000, but some small residual force. We still have forces in Germany post-World War II. We still have forces in the DMZ post the Korean War. And so there are models where we leave a residual force to ensure that those places don't become a threat again to our national security. Look, if you were a Gold Star mother and you lost a son in Afghanistan during the war, how would you feel to see any American diplomat sitting across the table from the Taliban?
What's curious to me is that as I was reading about the negotiations, which have now fallen through, I didn't have a good sense of what the assurances were. It seemed like the U.S. was coming to the table and the Taliban was offering their promises to not have any ties with al-Qaeda, to stop violence. But it was unclear to me what the U.S. was getting in return and how we could assure that they would keep their word.
This is my concern. There was no enforcement mechanism is what you're pointing to, and you're quite right. And by the way, we went into the negotiations saying that the president's goal was to remove all forces. It was clear from the beginning that was the president's intent, whether he got concessions or not. And that's not a strong position to go into any negotiation with. The Taliban understood we were talking from a position of weakness because the president wanted to keep a political commitment.
The U.S. side was showing its cards.
That's right.
The argument has been made that the troop drawdown from Iraq is what has led to or contributed to the rise of ISIS. What do you make of that, and do you think the same thing could happen in Afghanistan, as you were saying?
But this is exactly right. We need to learn the lessons of history, including recent history, right? President Trump was rightly, I think, critical of President Obama that the drawdown of troops in Iraq led to the rise of ISIS, and then we had to fight our way back to take the caliphate away from ISIS. Why should we think it would be any different in Afghanistan if we removed our troops and left the Taliban there? We know their historical relationship with al-Qaeda.
What is the current state of ISIS? We heard a lot, especially from the president, that they had been defeated, but now there are signs that they are growing again in power.
Yeah, we see a resurgence in places like Iraq, in Syria, and with the ongoing war in Yemen and the ungoverned space there, again, we see the rise of what used to be al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the rise of ISIS in Yemen. And so I have great concerns that that threat is going to come back because they use the safe haven to train, equip, plan, and recruit, right, to launch overseas attacks targeting Americans.
If there was a U.S. drawdown from Afghanistan, could ISIS continue to grow and thrive in places like Afghanistan?
Absolutely. Just as al-Qaeda did before 9/11, I think you will see the same sort of thing in Afghanistan with ISIS if there's a total withdrawal.
So now that we're 18 years, nearly 2 decades since the September 11th attacks, how much safer do you think we are from an international terrorist attack? Perhaps not a physical attack, but all types of attacks, cyber attacks.
So we spent trillions of dollars, and I think we have built ourselves both a border security and law enforcement capability as well as an intelligence capability. We have a much better sense of the threats as they emerge so that we can disrupt and stop them. Nothing's flawless. I mean, you have Americans around the world working 24/7 to thwart these attacks. And so I feel much better that we have a greater capability to prevent them. I worry, you mentioned cyber. I do worry about cyber attacks. I'm more worried about those coming from state actors as opposed to terrorists. But certainly terrorists use the internet as a means of communicating, as a means of planning. And so I worry about their use of cyber, but less as a disruptive or destructive attack.
Are there areas where terrorists might be exploring ways to attack the U.S. that are so not traditional, we're not even considering it, we're not even looking at it?
You know, post 9/11, the commission said what we had suffered from was a failure of imagination. That is to think of the unthinkable. I think we're better as a country about doing that. We look at things like nuclear, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and the sorts of ways that you would deploy that kind of weapon against Americans. And so I think we're better about thinking and trying to plan for the unthinkable. Sometimes you recognize a threat is so devastating that you can't prevent it entirely. But what you can do is take pieces of it and mitigate the consequences of such an attack. And I think we're better about thinking through and planning for that.
As a final thought, what is your piece of advice to the current administration as they work to fight both international and domestic terrorism?
So the most important thing we found in the fight about international terrorism was our allies. We can't be every place all the time, but our allies, sometimes your allies are better positioned to collect the intelligence, but it means you need to really rely on and strengthen those relationships. They're not perfect. You're going to have disagreements with your allies. You're better to have them privately than publicly. And you have to invest in those relationships on the front end so when you really need them, you can rely on them. And I think domestically, as I said earlier, we have to treat the domestic terrorism threat as seriously as we have historically treated the international threat. And we need to begin to take action, whether it's background checks, it's the assault weapons ban, it's not having bump stocks, it's not having extended magazines or armor-piercing bullets. There's a number of things you can do that will, if it doesn't reduce the number of attacks, it reduces the lethality, which means fewer Americans are killed or injured by these attacks.
Fran Townsend, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the CBS This Morning podcast.
Be sure to subscribe to get your morning news in under 20 minutes and daily podcast originals.
You can watch the CBS This Morning broadcast Monday through Saturday from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. on your local CBS station or live on the CBS All Access app.